just like to get started here. Professor Dr. Jeung, thank you for being with us. I'll introduce him to the group here. Dr. Jeung is the chair and professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University. He's the author of books exploring the intersection of race and religion, including Family Sacrifices, The Worldviews and Ethics of Chinese Americans, and At Home in Exile, Finding Jesus Among My Refugee Neighbors, which I just downloaded and I started, and I'm already getting this connection. It's like, this guy's talking my language. And then just this year, Dr. Jeung launched Stop AAPI Hate, a project of Chinese for Affirmative Action, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, and San Francisco State Asian American Studies. This project tracks COVID-19 related discrimination in order to develop community resources and policy interventions to fight racism. So it's a great pleasure to have you join us, and please, let's hear what you have to say.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks everyone for inviting me. Sorry you can't be at family camp. Seems like a great tradition, especially for the Midwest. Actually, what would be fun is I do have this book that came out, and it's about Chinese Americans and their worldviews. So it's, I interviewed 58 Chinese Americans across the nation, and it's based on a national survey. So what would be fun for you guys is I'll raffle off one for free. If you use the chat function, just make any comment, or especially write any questions down. Maybe Alan could curate the questions for me as I talk, and then you guys could pick out a random person and I'll send a book. So it's usually $30 on Amazon, but it was on sale for $6, so I got a whole bunch of them.
Good deal.
Okay, so feel free to chat, and I'm gonna talk about a pretty serious topic now that isn't really fun for camp, but is really relevant for today. And so, as you know, we're in the age of COVID-19, and when COVID was coming from China, I knew immediately that Asian Americans would be scapegoated and attacked because that's been our history in the US. And so we created Stop AAPI Hate, a reporting center with Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco and Asian Pacific Policy Planning Council in LA, to track incidents of hate and to also then, knowing the trends and the patterns, develop proactive policies to address the hate. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've learned. But then the Black Lives Matter uprisings occurred, and those racial injustices also sort of put our country into further turmoil, and it led Asian Americans now to consider the question, where do we belong, especially in the United States, as 3 out of 4 Asian Americans now fear racial bias during COVID-19. They're afraid that they may be harassed or shunned. They're concerned that when they return, their kids return to school, if they'll be bullied. And then with Black Lives Matter, and as we see the clear injustices faced by the African American community, we have to consider how do we fit in to the US racial dynamic that is primarily Black and white. And the case of Total really illustrates our complicated position. So Total is a Hmong American who is the officer who held back the crowds when Officer Chauvin choked George Floyd. And for we Asian Americans, we're already horrified by the choking of George Floyd, but then to see a fellow Asian American standing by and being participating, it sort of throws us off, because then we have to wonder, wow, he's clearly complicit in this police brutality, and Asians seeing a fellow Asian either have to distance themselves and say, oh, I'm not Hmong like him, I'm not a police officer like him, or we have to really acknowledge that, oh, this is part of our community, and our community is actually anti-Black, right? And there's a lot of racial prejudice within the Asian American community. So as we see Officer Total, we're sort of concerned and we get challenged. Are we complicit with white supremacy? Are we part of a system that oppresses African Americans? even if we just stand to the side and do nothing, if we feel like, well, we're neither white nor black, so we're not really engaged in that problematic dynamic, we're still complicit if we just stand on the side and do nothing, right? And so that's our situation. Asian Americans are often complicit with white supremacy, but at the same time, we also feel like, no, maybe we're in solidarity with African Americans. We're also minorities, we're also people of color. And for example, among refugees, they live in low income areas. They're actually more poor than African Americans. And a lot of Chinese Americans are more poor than a large number of African Americans. So the question is, where do we belong? Are we white or are we black? Especially as America understands itself in terms of black-white matters. So I'm going to give you a quick history lesson as you ponder, and you could even put in the chat if you identify more with whites because they have status and because they have privilege and because they have power and because they have wealth, and we want to be more like whites, and I talk white, or do you identify more African American because we're people of color, or have minority status, and their concerns are similar to our Asian American concerns in addressing racism. So you could sort of chat that if you want. But historically, Asians have been constructed as blacks in America. And you can see these historic cases. I'll just illustrate one. In the People versus Haw case in 1854, Haw shot and killed white people and Chinese people and killed them. And Chinese people testified against Haw. He was convicted and found guilty, but Haw appealed. And the Supreme Court ruled that the Chinese testimony didn't count, that Chinese were like African Americans and couldn't testify in the courts. We were denied any voice. And so in that Supreme Court case, we were made equivalents to blacks. In other laws, like African Americans, Chinese were considered not to be like white students since they were allowed to be segregated. We couldn't marry white people. And especially now, even today, in the Asian American underclass, I live in a low income area. A lot of Asians are considered black because of their class status. And so Asian Americans being constructed as black have tried to get out of that blackness, that position of inferiority, by trying to claim whiteness, right? It's not to be racially white, but to have the status of whiteness. So in these two court cases, they went to the Supreme Court. Seiji Ozawa tried to become naturalized. He claimed he was Christian. His kids grew up in the US. He went to Berkeley, but he was denied because he was clearly non-white. Thinned here, picture here, he said, South Asians, Indians are not really Asian, they're really Caucasian, anthropologically and biologically. And the US Supreme Court ruled then, yes, they may be scientifically Caucasian, but any person would think of a Hindu as non-white. So in those cases, we tried to become white, but we were denied whiteness. Over time, though, Asian Americans, and especially Chinese Americans, have gained some sense of whiteness as a model minority. During World War II, when the US was at war with Japan, China became its ally, and so Chinese became the good Asians in that war. And because it looked bad for the US to exclude their wartime ally, that's when they repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. During the Civil Rights era, African Americans were challenging white supremacy. And so Asian Americans were used as the good minority, saying, look at Asians face discrimination, but they don't complain, they don't protest, they just work hard and they gain whiteness. So we're used as the model minority. So an illustration of the model minority is a picture here of Asians having the great drive to excel. This is a picture of Stanford when I was going to school there, and these were my classmates. I didn't actually make that model, but my friends did. And now currently, the only Asians who actually are allowed to come to the United States are those who are professional and educated. A lot more come through professional visas than through family reunification visas. So maybe your families may, I don't know if your families came through professional status or as grad students, or if they came as Cantonese family members. But today, most of the Asians coming through are through selective immigration. So they already have high status, they already have high education. And so that's the construction of the model minority where Asians are more like white. So in the past, we were like Blacks. Today, we're constructed to be more like white. And so you could see in the racialization of Asian Americans, if America is a white Black society, we're caught in between these two groups. And obviously, most Chinese would want to be more like white, because who would want to be considered inferior, to remain poor, to remain less educated? So we have to attain whiteness in order to have any upward mobility. We have to assimilate. The problem, though, is that there's another dimension of racism, and this is really important for Chinese Americans. We're not only racialized as white or Black, we're also racialized on an East-West continuum. And Orientalism is this notion that the East is separate from the West, the East is a mirror image of the West, and the East is inferior to the West. The way the West understands itself is that it's better than the East, that the East is superstitious while the West is rational. The East is barbaric while the West is humanitarian. The East is maybe authoritarian while the West is democratic and equal. So this Orientalist divide paints the West as the model, as the insiders, and the East as the outsiders, always different, always exotic, always foreign. And so you could see being racialized as the outsider, that is how Asians are now portrayed during COVID-19. We may have gained some model minority status, but we've been pushed back over here as outsiders during COVID-19. And let me explain how. Throughout our history, we've been racialized as outsiders. We've been excluded by the Chinese Exclusion Act. We weren't allowed to buy land because we were aliens and couldn't be naturalized. Japanese were interned and incarcerated because they were seen as disloyal. Muslims were banned and not deserving to come to this Christian nation. Today, Southeast Asians are all being deported because they're not real Americans and they don't belong. So in all these laws and historic incidents, Asians aren't seen as real Americans who fit in, who belong, but we're considered outsiders to be excluded, to be incarcerated, and to be banned. And today's anti-Asian hate during COVID-19 really illustrates that. We're part of the yellow peril stereotype that Asians are coming to dominate and threaten the West. Historically, again, diseases from Asia have been used to mistreat us and to create racist policies. During the Chinese exclusion era, the three diseases of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy, they were specters of death emanating out of Chinatown to destroy and to kill Americans. And so because of these diseases, they became the basis of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And again, Chinese were met with racist policies, the Exclusion Act, and also interpersonal violence. Over 300 Chinese settlements, including my family's in Monterey, were actually driven out in the West Coast during the 19th century. 300 settlements, not individuals, but settlements, villages, towns were driven out. In 1900, the bubonic plague came to Chinatown in San Francisco, Honolulu, and Santa Ana. In San Francisco, Chinatown was segregated and roped off with ropes and barbed wires. Whites were allowed to leave, but they kept Chinese in to get the disease. In Santa Ana and Honolulu, they burned down buildings where people were infected, and those fires then spread, destroying the entire Chinatowns and leaving thousands homeless. It was ironic because that actually spread the rats that spread the disease further. So you could see in all these diseases, There are eerie parallels to today. A disease comes from Asia. Asians in the US get scapegoated. They're met with interpersonal violence and racist policies. That happened in Angel Island. If your families came through Angel Island, if they weren't found healthy, Chinese could be detained longer and will be deported if they're unhealthy. So because of health conditions and because of disease policies, Chinese have been excluded, quarantined, detained, deported, and harassed. And that's what's happening today. To date, I said we created Stop AAPI Hate, and we have over 2,000 incidents of hate directed towards Asian Americans. It's widespread. Over 45 states have submitted reports. And the most common issues are being verbally harassed and shunned. These aren't microaggressions. Vulnerable populations like children and elderly are getting yelled at with profanities, with racial epithets and slurs. And it's most people are traumatized by how angry and hateful people are. We face 8% of the cases are civil rights violations, where people face workplace discrimination, being barred from hotels and restaurants, being barred from ride shares like Uber. And another like 10 to 15% are cases of being coughed and spat upon or actually being physically assaulted. So those cases of assault are hate crimes because people are hitting us, throwing rocks at us, and then yelling racial biased statements. So I don't know if any of you have experienced these types of incidents of being coughed or spat upon. My family has been coughed on, and it's such a frequent occurrence. We noticed it, and we actually made it a separate category that people could check off if people are being coughed or spat upon. In New England, a white person coughed on the grocery produce and coughed on a white cashier on purpose, and he was arrested for terrorism. And so you could argue that Asians are facing mass terrorism because we're getting coughed and spat upon so much.
Professor Jeung, you obviously hit a nerve. There's about 12.5 comments about how people identify, and there's a couple of questions.
Okay, yeah. Go ahead and ask them. I can't see the chat, sorry.
Okay, sure, I'll pull it up. So one question is, what do you make of the black and brown language that has been recently used, and where do Asians from various countries fit into that?
Okay. Is that the only question? Because I'm going to come back to where we fit in.
Then another one interesting, is there such a thing as Asian privilege? Let's see, then there's, then specific to this present part of the presentation, is there a graphic to show geographic distribution of incidents? And then I just was wondering, how is this information collected? How did you tally and find that?
So I'll quickly answer a few of those, and then my main talk deals with the first ones. So this data is collected through online reporting where people self-report. So we have, we don't confirm or verify it, but we just believe if people are going to take the time to find us, go online and report, it's their experience of racism, so it's valid. 1 out of 9 are elderly. So you don't think of Chinese elderly going online and reporting and complaining about racism, but they are, because they recognize when they're mistreated. 5% of the cases are non-English speakers. They're going in and typing in Vietnamese or in Korean because they too, immigrants recognize mistreatment and they know when someone's yelling a slur at them. So we're getting those reports. We're not a silent, acquiescent minority. People are complaining, and I think I'm glad they could report to us because we're using this to inform policymakers. I'll go back to our relationship to Blacks in a bit. We're getting harassed a lot in businesses because that's where we interact with people and shelter in place, but that's a civil rights violation. If we get harassed at a store, we're not getting public accommodations. We're not getting safe access to goods and services. Everybody has that right. So that's one of our policy recommendations in California, is to ensure that people's civil rights to goods and services are being protected. And so we need a complaint system for this type of harassment. People are facing discrimination because of race. 60% of our respondents aren't Chinese. They're people who look Chinese, right? Koreans, Vietnamese, Japanese. The worst case was a family from Burma were attacked and slashed in the head in Sam's Club in Texas. There was a 2-year-old, a 6-year-old, and the father were all attacked. They weren't Chinese, but the assailant said, "It's because of you Chinese you have the coronavirus." A Latino in LA and an indigenous person in Vancouver, they were attacked and said to go back to China. So just, if you look Chinese, you're gonna face this anti-Chinese sentiment. The face mask has become a new racialized object of scorn. So a lot of Asians say it's because we were wearing a face mask early on that we're getting mistreated. And gender is actually a real factor. Women face harassment 2.3 times more than men. So here, to sum up the race relations, Asians do have privileges. We have racial privileges. Sometimes we move and we become the model minority. We're not seen like Blacks, and so we don't get harassed by police as much. We aren't considered, we're considered smart actually, right? So we get all this status as the insiders. But now, because of COVID-19, because we're associated as, you know, when Trump keeps on using the term Chinese virus, people assume the virus is Chinese and Chinese people have the virus. And that association pushes us as outsiders, as outside threats. As people see us as threats, they go into flight or fight mode. They fight us and attack us, or they flee us and shun us. And that's what's happening. They see us as outside threats. So again, we're facing a different racialization than Blacks do. Whereas Blacks are considered part of America, Asians and Latinos are considered not really parts of America. People always ask you, where do you come from, right? Because they don't assume you belong. Even if your family's been here 4 or 5 generations like mine, they'll still ask you, you know, where are you from? Oh, you speak English so well, right? That's that foreigner expectation, that stereotype that Asians have. So I'm arguing Asians face a different discrimination than Blacks do, but overall, we're both outside the white supremacy system. Blacks can discriminate against us and think of us as outsiders. And so we see a lot of communities of color saying, go back home to, you know, Asians. So Asians face discrimination from Blacks, and Blacks can face racism from Asians because we treat them in this way. But overall, both groups can work in solidarity with each other against a system that oppresses them. And that's my argument. You could see through COVID-19 that white supremacy and the racial inequality of America has been laid bare. African Americans, the Navajo Nation, Pacific Islanders, and Latinos all have much higher rates of COVID-19. Asian Americans actually have higher death rates at COVID-19 because Asians who get COVID-19 are usually the elderly. You can also see how racist our system is because, you know, again, we're facing racism, and also our businesses have been shut down earlier because people were boycotting our businesses, right? Asians working in the restaurant business, nail salons, hotels, they're more economically disproportionately hard hit than others, and they'll stay more economically hard hit. So overall, I'll just sort of wrap up here. And both statements are true. Asian Americans are complicit with white supremacy, and they are anti-Black at the same time. So are we in solidarity with Black or Blackness? No, a lot of times we are anti-Black and we are complicit in white supremacy. But at the same time, we can resist racism as people of color and work in solidarity with African Americans. So are we white or Black? The question is, yes, we could be both on the side of whiteness and on the side of Blackness. And Asian Americans are racially positioned on 2 dimensions. We can understand Blackness, but we could also understand being on the outsider. And that's how we're racialized. So for us, anti-racism entails both addressing our own racism of anti-Blackness and also dismantling whiteness as a system. So one of the problems with race relations in the US, it's either or. You're either white or Black, you're either Eastern or Western. And what we need to do is sort of get rid of those binaries, these ways of thinking, right? And that's my suggestion. Instead, what we need to do is imagine an America that we do want to belong to. So I started off by asking, do we belong in America? And as people are racist towards us, we feel like we don't belong. When we don't see ourselves represented in Hollywood or in movies, we feel like, oh, I want some representation so I can belong. But I've realized I don't really want to belong to the US when it's so racist, when it steals indigenous lands, when it has such a lousy health system now and a terrible economic system. I don't want to go back to normal. I don't want to belong to America. But as an Asian American, as a Chinese American, I want to reimagine America to be an America that I want to belong to, that I want my kids to belong to. And for that means we have to dismantle the old system of the white founding fathers and a system built on slavery and a system built on stealing land, and actually come up with a new multiracial democracy where everyone could belong, and it's based not on our theft of labor and resources, but actually based on the virtues of all the groups. So that would mean for Asian Americans and for Chinese Americans is that we help build a new America by being more Asian. That one of the problems with America is that it's too white or Black, it's too East or West. And what we need for the United States is to have more Asianness in it.
Wow.
Yeah, so I'll wrap up there and then take more questions. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Jeung. That was a whirlwind, but it was just really great to just get all of the dimensions, Yeah, so a couple of questions, just going in reverse order. So one was, during your study, did any stats or findings surprise you? And then we had a previous question about any kind of geographical distribution about the reports.
What surprises me, there are a couple of things that surprised me. I shouldn't be surprised, but again, women are harassed so much. I was surprised that, again, elderly are reporting so much and non-English speakers are reporting so much. I'm really surprised at how hateful people are. You could really feel the anger is really palpable because people are screaming obscenities. Gangs of people are picking on elderly strolling grandkids. Like, why would people take the time to stop, get out of their car and spit at people? It's I don't really get it, but people obviously are really angry and scared, and during the pandemic are maybe acting the way they wouldn't normally do. But it shows me, I guess, how conditional our status in America is. We could go from model minority to perpetual foreigner right away. I think healthcare professionals are recognizing it. You're an Asian American doctor, you think you've got it with your educational attainment, you think you've made it with your professional status, but really, even Asian American doctors are getting mistreated by their own patients, right? Patients don't want to be treated by doctors because they think they may be infected. So our status in America is really conditional. During periods of war, periods of epidemic, Asians are scapegoated and on the outside. In terms of geographic distribution, again, it's spread out throughout the United States. We get more reports from concentrations where there are Asians. And it's just like New York and San Francisco, there's probably more racially conscious Asian Americans who want to report. We get a lot from Illinois is probably the third or fourth leading state, you Midwestern people. Texas has really more assaults than the rest of the country. But yeah, because it's self-reported, it's people who have access to knowing about our center.
Yep. Great, thank you. And then another question, how optimistic are you about the future?
Oh, that's a tough question, huh? Depends on the day, depends on if I see cute kids and puppies or if I read incidents of hate. I'm hopeful for the next generation that they could reimagine a better America, that the demographic shift to having more communities of color will change the political dynamic of the country. So there'll be demographic shifts. I'm really worried about global warming and climate change. So that always throws us into this echo anxiety. So but I'm a person of faith too, so I'm hopeful. So it's, to be honest, it's often mixed, and I'm hopeful because I can't be otherwise, or else you become cynical and apathetic, and I'd rather be hopeful and faithful and doing what's right.
Yep. Great. Let's see.
Oh, lots of chat.
Lots of chats going on. So
okay, I'll go away 2 books since there's so many chats.
You hit a nerve, I'm telling you. So there's the question of Black, brown language, and just all of the terms, Asian, Oriental, you know, all these, the language of it sometimes kind of sets a certain like scope of like what can be thought of, or how people can be considered. So I guess one is, where do we fit into the people of color, brown, white, Black, you know, that language? And then what are you know, looking at your idea of kind of a more Asian infusion into the American culture, like what's some language that would give us a place to like speak from?
Okay, those are great questions. Words do matter. Again, the insistence of the term Chinese virus makes the virus Chinese, and Chinese people have the virus. And so people are, again, racially profiling us because they make that automatic assumption an Asian person is diseased and the disease is Asian. It's just like the terms fireman, policeman, councilman. If you use those terms, you picture that person as a male rather than council member, firefighter, or police officer. So words matter. And that's why I think it's really important that our congressional, Asian Pacific American congressional delegation, our states are denouncing anti-Asian rhetoric and making official statements supporting Asian Americans and denouncing racism. Those official statements I used to think are symbolic, but those symbolic statements are really important. So I would have any institution, your school, your corporation, call them to make these resolutions, to make these statements of denouncing hate, because those words do matter and it sets the culture. We have a culture of hate right now that's normalized. We need to normalize a culture of respect and dignity. And that's where our Asianness does come in. I think to counter a lot of this American individualism and this like expression of rights that I shouldn't wear a mask should be balanced by an Asian sense of, well, no, I do things for the public good. You know, the face mask isn't an expression of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. For Asians, a mask is a culture of respect because I don't want to get you sick. And that Asianness, that sense of responsibility, that sense of respect for the other, the sense of concern for the other, that's what America needs, right? It needs an Asian sense of collective responsibility, of social justice. So that's just one way where we have to shift the narrative, where the face mask isn't something that's your right not to wear or a symbol of a disease. The face mask is a symbol of respect and courtesy. That's part of the good from Asia.
Yep. Great.
Yeah, sorry, I could go on.
Thanks so much. Yep. Question, suggestions on how to react or act if we are objects of anti-Asian aggression or witnesses to Asian aggression.
Yeah, we should be bystanders. If you, again, if you don't do anything, you're like Total standing outside and being complicit when racism continues. So unless we intervene and become good bystanders, upstanders, then we're part of the problem. And so the way to intervene is to help the person, and you don't acknowledge the perpetrator. You don't want to give them more platform, but you help the person who's being targeted and say, can I help you? Do you need any support? You could set boundaries and say, that type of language is racist. I don't like that type of behavior. It's inappropriate. So you set boundaries, but then you don't engage with them further. Instead, you tend to the safety of that person who's being attacked. That's our advice. And then report, because by reporting it, it lets people express how they felt. It helps them externalize the issue. It's often really traumatizing, so it's good to give social support to the person. So if you witness it, you help the targeted person, and then you help them report it. Because by reporting it, people know it's happening, and that way it won't happen to someone else. The purpose of reporting is for you to externalize the issue, but also to prevent it from happening again. And so again, it's not just for you to report, but it's for the other person who it's going to be believed next.
Wow.
So again, report to Stop AAPI Hate. We just wrote to Governor Newsom, and we're working with California. We're doing a New York press conference, and we're having a Texas press conference tomorrow. So we hope to come to the Midwest. We're working with groups in Indiana and Illinois.
Wow, that's great.
Can I
go ahead.
Question?
Clarence, go ahead.
Oh, Professor Jeung, thank you very much for your talk. I'm interested in your study because it's very relevant. I think that that Trump's use of the Chinese virus certainly has led to an increase in racist actions against Asian Americans. But I'm not quite sure I understood the methodologies. So you said you had 2,000 people who responded to the study. So over what period of time was the study done, and where were these 2,000 people? Were they all over the whole country, or what?
Yeah, we're not a study. We're a reporting center that's tracking hate incidents. So we're not a representative sample. We're not a random sample. We're just collecting people's stories. And so if you hear about the reporting center, then people are reporting. But we can say that the trends we're seeing emerge are consistent over time. Since mid-March, when we launched the site, till now, we've gathered over 2,000 cases across the nation. And so again, there's been a steady pattern. Women are harassed more than men. That's pretty clear. Steady pattern. Anti-Chinese rhetoric goes along with physical assault. So people are saying, go back to China to people. People are saying, you Chinese eat such weird bats. People are saying, you Jink, so it's, so non-Chinese feel stigmatized because they're stigmatized as being disease carrier, and then they're being called Chinese when they're not even Chinese. So they hate it more than Chinese people do, probably.
Okay, I'm gonna just.
Can you say that there's been an increase recently in anti-Asian racist actions?
That's a great question. We expect the hate to actually grow. And that's because U.S.-China relations is becoming a central campaign theme in the presidential election. So the more politicians bash China, the more people bash Chinese in the U.S. The economy's tanking, we're sheltered in place longer, and the pandemic is surging. So that's like a perfect storm for people to get angry and want to scapegoat. So our fear is that when people go back to school, when they go more back to normal, they're going to face an increased surge of hate, especially if people keep on using the terms like Chinese virus. When Trump used it, we saw a clear spike after the insistence of that term. So we're concerned that it's going to get worse before it gets better, and that's why we're trying to do all these policy initiatives now.
Yeah, that's great. Professor Chung, I'm going to wrap up with just a couple of questions. Can you just speak about your department at San Francisco State, and then a couple of people have asked about your books. Can you just kind of do a quick little few sentences on the books that you've written?
Oh, sure. I'd be happy to do little commercials. San Francisco State Asian American Studies is the oldest and largest Asian American Studies program in the country. We started over 50 years ago, and we actually have over 60 classes in Asian American Studies. We range from Chinese American literature, Chinese American history, Chinese American identity, to classes on environmental justice, Asian American sexualities, Asian Americans, and environmental justice. So we have an MA program, and right now everything's online because of the pandemic. This book up here, I don't know, look like the product placement. Again, it's based on a national survey, and one of the few national surveys of Asians across the country, and we were able to understand Chinese values and traditions. So Chinese actually are the ethnic group that is least religious in the US. We often say we are of no religion. We check off none. So over half of Chinese Americans do not affiliate with any religion. So I asked, well, if we aren't religious, then what do we believe? What do we do? And it turns out we are still really at our roots very Confucian and very following of Chinese popular religious traditions. So we still do a lot of ancestor veneration. During Lunar New Year, we do a lot of rituals or avoidance of taboos. And so I talk about it, what it means for second generation. You know, we don't know what it means to do, you know, why are we eating a mooncake? You know, why are we eating jai? We don't get any of that, but we still do it because it tastes good and it's fun. We still give red envelopes because that's how we celebrate holidays. We give gifts. And so it talks about the transition of Confucianism and Chinese popular religion into everyday practices for Chinese. So we don't have a name for it, but we do it. We always have these family rotating potlucks. We have reunions like Chinese family camp. We do all these things. And so I argue Chinese may not believe in anything, but they do things really religiously, like attend family camp. And that becomes sort of like our.
Yep.
Yeah, hi, Hetty.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna kind of wrap it up. That's our 45 minutes. Just Dr. Jeung, thank you. Just really thank you on behalf of all of us. There's 35 screens kind of tuned into the channel right now. I just want to thank you for your time and for your kind of ongoing dedication to the Asian American experience and the characterizing of it, and also collecting this information. We'll stay on for the next session. Starts at the top of the hour. Professor Jeung, if you can stick around, we can just have people just toss questions at you like shotgun style, and we can keep going for just a few more minutes. So anybody just want to pop a question?
Yeah, you guys can pick out the raffle prize winners. So I have a couple of books.
Okay.
Sitting around, I could sign it and mail it to you guys. So
Oh, that's
thanks
great.
for
Okay.
listening so patiently.
No, it's great. Thanks. Anyone want to just pepper the professor with questions?
Yes. This is Clarence. And you have a website you said that people responded to?
Yeah, go to Stop AAPI Hate.
Say that again?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat.
You had mentioned that 3 out of 4 Asians had trepidation or anxiety about racism from COVID.
And
I forgot what the actual statement was. Was that separated by which Asian countries you're talking about? Were they Vietnamese? Were they Chinese? Were they Japanese? Or what?
No, they were
much differentiation between.
No, they were lumped together. But one poll, the Harris poll, said 3 out of 4 Asians lumped together. Another poll compared Chinese to Koreans, and they had similar fears, right? And because it's based on racial profiling, and Koreans know that they're confused with being Chinese all the time. So if you disaggregate the data, the more Chinese you look, the heightened fear you have, basically. 1 out of 3 Asian Americans report being harassed by the Pew Research Foundation.
Wow.
Oh, and we have a youth camp, and about 1 out of 4 youth report being harassed. The ones we talked to, we've surveyed about 900 API youth. But again, it's a selective snowball sample. So.
Sure. Anyone else? Questions?
Russell, this is Hetty. I was
hey,
wondering, what are your thoughts about the alliances that we could or should be building around the protests around police brutality, and whether there are opportunities for creating stronger alliances, particularly with the African American community, with Blacks, at this moment in time, or whether that, I'm just curious if you have any advice or thoughts, or how you all are trying to work out, because there's a way in which, if you broaden brutality in a lot of ways, we're also seeing, like right now, whatever, there's some, anti-racism is expanding at the same time that you're still seeing this. And I don't want to take away from the ongoing police brutality that African-American communities have faced, and in a much more significant way in which they're constantly afraid of their lives. But is there alliance building that's possible at this time? I guess awareness of the challenge of police brutality.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And for Stop AAPI Hate, we find ourselves, or we're in partnership with Black Lives Matter, and that by fighting anti-Asian racism and dismantling white supremacy, we're also supporting Black Lives Matter. And just as much as Black Lives Matter dismantles white supremacy, that would probably help end anti-Asian racism, right? So they're parallel efforts, both targeting to end white supremacy, dismantle it, and to provide racial justice for all. So again, they're parallel and we work in partnership. What I tell youth is that as Asian Americans realize we're getting racially profiled now, right? We're seen as outsiders and we're seen as threats. And that's exactly how other community groups are, you know, and because we could understand what it means to be a threat, because we understand what it means to be an outsider, then we should have more empathy and solidarity for those who are being mass detained at the border and be considered outsiders. We could understand and have more sympathy for people who are being banned, like the Muslim ban. And now we are getting banned, right? There's a second Chinese Exclusion Act. They're banning Chinese grad students and they're banning international students. And then we should understand how the African American community is being mass incarcerated because they're seen as threats. So I tell youth all the time, as you experience and feel what's going on, then you can develop some solidarity with other communities and fight their fight alongside. So I think, you know, when anti-Asian stuff came a lot earlier, like in January, February, and African-American groups were alongside us really early on. So I felt a lot of support and solidarity from my African-American faculty colleagues in my union. In church groups, I've seen a lot of solidarity. So I think there's a lot of sites of solidarity between the two groups. And so it's both and. Sometimes we're complicit with white supremacy. I've seen Asian American police officers being really brutal, but I think I also see a lot of Asian American communities standing alongside our Black and brown brothers and sisters. And so
About 3 or 4 weeks ago in Chicago, they had a rally from some Chinese churches, and they walked to a Black church, and it was somewhat the announcer talking about it was somewhat reconciliatory, saying like, you know, we apologize for the animosity that the Asians had toward the Black community and vice versa. And I kind of wasn't really aware of an animosity between the Asians and the Blacks in there. And so I looked at it online. They were talking about primarily like in the Rodney King years, when they had the riots, the Koreans, a lot of their stores were being set on fire, and they had problems that way. Then they talked about the Korean. Apparently, they do a lot of the supplying of the African American hair products, and they kind of have a monopoly on it. And are you aware of Asian versus Black?
Yeah. Can
you comment on that? Or?
Yeah, where I live, there's a lot of heightened tension. If you have Asian American small businesses located in low-income areas, the low-income neighborhood, if you're not giving back to the community, you're seen as taking away from the community. So there's been Chinese, you know, corner stores, Chinese liquor stores. In the South, there's a lot of Chinese grocery stores, right? So again, we're seeing in that case, the middle minority, again, taking economic resources away from the African American community and not really fully giving back, and then wanting to be white. And so I think there's a lot of animosity from the African American community because of that. And again, the Black Korean issue, I think during the Rodney King uprisings was more media generated, but there are tensions between the communities that need to be reconciled. And that's why the Chicago protests and and the reconciliation of churches was really powerful. And they're going to do a similar one in LA of Asian American faith-based groups supporting Black Lives Matter. You know, the Asian American and churches have been really split theologically, but they've come together along because of COVID-19 and the racism. That's COVID-19 is really leading to the mobilization of the Asian American community. People are recognizing we're facing an outside threat, so it's bringing together the community. So usually churches that don't work together, they're working together. Ethnic groups that don't work together, they're working together because, like the Vincent Chin days, people don't see us as individual ethnic groups. They just lump us together as Asians and attack us.
Okay,
I
last
have
question.
can I ask about Black Lives Matter? It seems to be a multi-layered, I guess, entity, depending upon who jumps on board and who doesn't. And some of the founders are related as Marxists. Can you define better, you know, what is inclusive or excluded from the multi-layers of Black Lives Matter? Because I know the LGBTQ community wanted to jump on, as well as the trans community. So could you comment on what this monolith is composed, especially, I guess, in your area, since that's probably be closest to your knowledge base?
Yeah, so it's a movement that is fluid and takes in a lot of ideas and ideologies and addresses a lot of oppressions. And so, I mean, if you're a Marxist, you could take a Marxian analysis and not necessarily, you know, support communism. You could agree that workers get exploited by their bosses and by businesses. So I think saying, so, you know, one of the founders comes from San Francisco State, is a colleague. And so I think their Marxian orientation is a framework of analysis that I think is valid. So again, different Black Lives Matter localities have different orientations, but I think overall, the movement is just aimed to highlight, wow, Black lives should matter and not face so much brutality and harassment and incarceration by the justice system. I think that's the primary overall overreaching goal. It's been amazing to see Americans shift in attitudes. You know, before people didn't support Black Lives Matter, but when they see so much video footage of innocent African-American people getting shot, I think that's really swayed perception. And for me, even for a Stop AAPI Hate, when we get videos of Asian Americans being harassed, that makes news. I could say, oh, 2,000 incidents, nobody cares. But if we have a video shot of it, you know, that really moves people. So I think the combination of having the data plus having these incidents filmed by smartphones is how you know, incite a movement now. It's a combination of having a catchword like Black Lives Matter, videos, plus documentation, and then the analysis that I think we could actually drive forward the movement.
Great.
Yeah.
But again, thank you, Professor Jeung. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you so much.